Welcome back to the Peony Patterns YouTube channel. My name is Ashley and I am the sew along host here at Peony Patterns. Today we are going to be sewing the beautiful hibiscus pattern together. So hibiscus is a gorgeous knit playsuit, top or dress pattern that is perfect for the warmer months. It features a unique elasticized flutter and sweet back bodice ties. The dress features a twirl-worthy circle skirt and the semi-fitted playsuit includes optional pockets. If you haven't yet purchased your copy of the hibiscus pattern, I will link that down below for you to go ahead and purchase that prior to us beginning sewing. Before we do jump in and begin sewing, I would like to say a massive thank you to Dusty Moon Fabric Studio, who so generously sponsored the hibiscus sew along and gifted us with the beautiful fabrics that I will be using throughout the sew along to create my hibiscus dress and playsuit. If you are watching this video shortly after we have uploaded it, then there is an exclusive discount code for our followers to shop with Dusty Moon Fabric Studio. If you use the code PP Sew Along, that will score you 20% off store-wide. The code will be valid until the 11th of June 2024. I will pop all of the details down below for Dusty Moon Fabric Studio if you would like to go have a look at their beautiful collection of fabrics. We are now going to jump straight in and see the pattern pieces that I have cut and prepared firstly for both my hibiscus dress and playsuit. Then we will begin sewing. So here are my pattern pieces firstly for my hibiscus dress. So firstly for the dress, I have my two dress skirt pieces cut. They are both cut on the fold. Alternatively, you can cut the top skirt length if you are making the top version. Then for my bodice, I have two front bodice pieces cut. They are both cut on the fold and I have one of those in my main fabric and the other in my lining. I also made sure to mark the flutter placement notches on those as well. I then have two back bodice pieces cut. They are both also cut on the fold and I once again have one in my main fabric and the other in my lining. Here are my four flutter pieces cut. So I have four of those cut as two mirror image sets of each other. I have chosen to cut all four of those in my main fabric. However, you will need two main and two lining. I then have four back bodice tie pieces cut and I have cut all four of those in my main fabric. You will then also need elastic for your flutters that is 3/8 of an inch wide. The measurements for that elastic will differ depending on what size you are making and you will find the measurements on page 14 of the hibiscus pattern. Now here are all of the pattern pieces cut then for my hibiscus playsuit. So firstly for the playsuit, I have two back playsuit pieces cut as a mirror image set down here. Then I have my two front playsuit pieces cut also as a mirror image set. You also have the optional playsuit pockets. So I have chosen to add those. So I have two of those cut once again as a mirror image set of each other. Then for the bodice, I have two front bodice pieces cut. They are cut on the fold and I have one in my main and one in my lining. And I've made sure to also mark the flutter placement notches on both of those. Then I have two back bodice pieces cut. They are also cut on the fold and I have one in my main, one in my lining. Here are my four flutter pieces. So I've cut four of those once again in my main fabric. However, you can choose to cut two in your main and two in your lining, and they will be cut as two mirror image sets. Then I have my four back bodice tie pieces cut up here. Now they are cut as two mirror image sets as well. And I have cut all four of those in my main fabric. Once you have all of your pattern pieces cut, then all you will need is your elastic for your flutters. So as I mentioned before, the measurements for the elastic are on page 14 of the hibiscus pattern. But that is all of my pattern pieces cut and prepared for my hibiscus dress and hibiscus playsuit. Now to begin the construction of our hibiscus dress, top or Playsuit, the first step is optional but is definitely recommended, and that is to apply a lightweight knit interfacing to the sweetheart neckline of the front bodice and also the cut out neckline section of the back bodice. This will help add stability and also hold the shape in these pieces. So we are going to cut a strip of fusible knit interfacing using our pattern piece as a guide. Now we are going to cut this so that it is approximately 1.5 inches in width, taking into account also the seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch. So I have cut that strip of fusible interfacing so that it fits on my front bodice with approximately 3/8 of an inch to spare around the neckline and the side edges. We are then going to press that in place. So once we then have that strip of fusible interfacing pressed in place to our front bodice, we are then going to repeat those steps for the cutout neckline in our back bodice as well. So the same thing again, I have cut my strip of fusible knit interfacing to be approximately 1.5 inches in width, but I've also taken into account the seam allowance around that cut out neckline, which is 3/8 of an inch. So I've cut and placed that strip of interfacing so that there is still approximately 3/8 of an inch to spare around the cutout. I'm now going to press that in place as well. Then we can pop our back bodice aside. Now, if desired, knit interfacing can also be applied to the curved ends of the back bodice ties using the pattern piece as a guide and then simply trimming off the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I have gone ahead and already prepared my piece of interfacing for that area. So as you can see, I have simply used the pattern piece as a guide and have just trimmed 3/8 of an inch off around those curved edges. We are then going to center that interfacing over the curved end of the back bodice ties, and we're going to press that in place, keeping in mind that only one back bodice tie per set will need to be interfaced. So you will only need to interface 2 of your 4 back bodice tie pieces. Once you have then interfaced 2 of your back tie pieces, we are now going to begin sewing. Now we are going to begin the construction of either our hibiscus dress, top or Playsuit by preparing the back bodice ties. Now if you did follow along in that previous step of adding the optional fusible interfacing to 2 of your back bodice tie pieces, we will now be pairing each of those with another back tie piece that is not interfaced, as we only need 1 interfaced piece per set. So we are going to take 2 of our back tie pieces and place those right sides together, aligning the raw edges. We are then going to pin or clip those in place. So I've just pinned 1 set of my back tie pieces right sides together. I'm now going to repeat that for my remaining set. So now we are going to head to the sewing machine using a stretch stitch and a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to sew along the long and curved edges only. So we will not be sewing along the short, raw, straight edges. So I'm going to go ahead now to sew both of my back tie pieces, then we'll be back with the next steps. Once you have then sewn your 2 sets of your back bodice tie pieces, we are now going to pop one of those aside and head back to just working on 1 set at a time. So we are now going to clip the pointed end of the back bodice tie, being careful to not clip through any stitching. Then we are going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. Alternatively, pinking shears can be used. Making sure at this stage that you have also not sewn this short, raw, straight end, so we will not be trimming that at all. Now the next step is to reduce any bulk in this narrow tip section. So what we are going to be doing is carefully tapering each side of that angled point down to 1/8 of an inch, being careful not to clip too close to the stitching when doing so. We are then going to turn the back bodice tie correct side out using a turning tool. Then push out the pointed tip very carefully, ensuring not to pierce through the point of the tie. Then we're going to press carefully using a low heat setting. Now once pressed, it is important at this stage to check the length of the back bodice tie against the paper pattern piece, as knit fabric tends to stretch when sewn, so we want to ensure that our back bodice ties have not stretched out of shape and become distorted, so check that. If the back bodice tie has stretched without recovering back to its original size, you can simply trim it down to the correct length from the short raw end of the tie before proceeding. We are then going to repeat those steps for our remaining set of back bodice tie pieces. Once you've then repeated those steps for your remaining set of back bodice tie pieces, we are now going to locate the back bodice main piece. Now we are going to be placing that right sides facing up towards us, and taking a removable sewing marker, we are going to measure 3/8 of an inch down from the straight raw edge of one of the shoulders, and we are going to place a mark along the raw curved edge of the cutout section of the back neckline. Then repeat that for the opposite side. Then we are going to place one of the back bodice ties along the top section of the corresponding side of the back bodice, correct sides together, aligning the top edge of the back bodice tie with the mark made previously on the back bodice. Ensure that the short raw end of the back bodice tie is also aligned with the raw edge of the cutout section of the back neckline. We are then going to pin or clip that in place. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine, where we are going to baste our back bodice tie in place where we have it pinned, using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have then basted that back bodice tie in place, we are then going to repeat those same steps for our remaining back bodice tie piece on the opposite side of the opening of our back bodice. Once you have then basted your second set of back bodice ties in place, we can now pop our back bodice aside. Now we are going to be constructing our flutters. So we are going to be locating the flutter pieces and placing one of the flutter lining pieces over the corresponding flutter main piece, correct sides together. Now, as I mentioned, I cut all 4 of my flutter pieces in my main fabric, as that is just a personal preference for me. However, if you have chosen to cut one set in your main fabric and the other in your lining, you will now be using one main and one lining piece. Then we are going to be placing those right sides together, aligning all of the raw edges. We are then going to pin or clip those in place. Now once pinned, we are going to head back to the sewing machine, where we are going to sew to attach using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch along the top curved edge and the bottom straight raw edges only. So we will not be sewing along the 2 short raw side edges. Once you have then finished sewing one set of your flutters right sides together, then we are going to be clipping the curve, being careful not to clip through any stitching. We are then going to trim the top and the bottom seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. Alternatively, pinking shears can be used. Now, as we have not sewn these short, raw, straight side edges, we will not be trimming or clipping those edges at all. Once we have then trimmed the seam allowance down along the top and the bottom, we are then going to turn the flutter correct side out using a turning tool. Then we can press carefully using a low heat setting. Once you have then pressed your flutter, we are then going to place the flutter main side facing up towards us. Beginning at the straight bottom edge, we are going to measure up 1/4 inch and place a mark along the left-hand side raw side edge of the flutter using a removable sewing marker. Then repeat for the right-hand side raw side edge. Now, using our removable sewing marker again and a ruler, we are going to draw a guideline from one side of the flutter to the other at the positions marked. It is very important that this guideline is straight and accurate. Then measure up 1/2 inch from the previous marked guideline and place a mark along the left-hand side raw edge of the flutter. And we will use our removable sewing marker to do that again. Then repeat for the right-hand side raw side edge. Now, once again, taking our ruler and removable sewing marker, we are then going to draw a guideline from one side of the flutter to the other side at the positions marked. Once again, it's very important to ensure that this guideline is also straight and accurate. Now, heading back to the sewing machine, we are now going to sew carefully over both guidelines using a straight stitch, ensuring to backstitch at each end. The channel created will then become the elastic casing. So once you have then sewn along both of those guidelines to now create your casing for your elastic, we are going to locate the flutter elastic piece and give it a few good stretches, then recheck the length. If the elastic has stretched without recovering to the original size, simply trim it back to the correct length. Now we are going to insert a safety pin through the end of the elastic, or alternatively you can use a bodkin, and we are going to begin to thread the elastic through the channel in the flutter. Now, once the tail end of the elastic reaches the opening where it was first threaded through, we do not want to pull the elastic all the way through the channel. We want to align the raw edges of the opening of the channel with the raw edge of the elastic. Secure that in place with a pin. Then we are going to head to the sewing machine to secure the elastic in place using 1/4 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once you have then secured that end of elastic in place, we are then going to continue threading the elastic through the remainder of the channel in the flutter. Once the opening at the other end has been reached as well, again we are going to align the raw edges of the channel and the elastic, ensuring that the elastic has not become twisted at all. We are going to pop a pin in to hold that in place. Then we can head back to the sewing machine where we can secure that end of elastic in place using 1/4 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch. Once you have then secured the other end of elastic in place, this is then what your flutter will look like. Then we can go ahead and repeat those steps for the remaining flutter. So once you have repeated those steps and you have your 2 flutters completed, we are then going to bring back our front bodice main piece. So now to begin the construction of the bodice, we are going to locate the front bodice main piece and place it correct side facing up towards us. Ensure that the flutter placement notches have also been marked along the top curved neckline. We are then going to take one of our flutters and place the short raw edge of the flutter along the top raw edge of one side of the neckline on the front bodice main piece, right sides together. Now we are centering the short raw edge of the flutter over the flutter placement mark on our bodice, ensuring that the curved edge of the flutter is facing the arm's eye or side edge of the bodice. Once we have that centered over the flutter placement notch, we can pin that in place. Then head to the sewing machine where we are going to baste the flutter in place using 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once we have then secured our first flutter in place, we are then going to repeat that for our remaining flutter on the opposite side of the front bodice main piece. Once you have then secured your second flutter in place, we are now going to locate the front bodice lining piece and place it over the front bodice main, right sides together, aligning the raw edges. The flutters will now be sandwiched in between the main and the lining. We are then going to pin or clip the main and lining fabrics together along the arm's eye and the neckline. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew where we have pinned using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch, being careful not to accidentally catch the flutters in the seam. A quick tip at this stage when sewing the Sweetheart neckline is that it can be very helpful to reduce the stitch length along the curved seam. When the center point of the neckline is reached, drop the needle down into the fabric, lift the presser foot and rotate the bodice. Drawing the seam allowance onto the fabric using a removable sewing marker is also an option prior to sewing, as you can then use this as a guide when sewing to assist in achieving a beautiful smooth curve. I'm now going to go ahead to my sewing machine now to sew around the neckline, and I will be back with the next steps. Once you have then sewn your front main and lining bodices together at the neckline, now on one side of the neckline we are going to reinforce the flutter attachment by sewing another line of stitching. Using a straight stitch, it is going to be 1/8 inch above the initial seam so that the reinforcement stitching is inside of the seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead now to sew both of those reinforcement stitches on both of my flutters. Once you have then sewn those reinforcement stitches, securing those flutters in place, then we are going to snip the center V point using scissors or snips, being very careful to not accidentally cut through any of the stitching. Now we are going to clip the curves, being careful to not clip through any stitching once again, then trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Alternatively, pinking shears can be used. Now we can turn the front bodice correct side out. Then we can press carefully using a low heat setting. Once pressed, we are now going to pop our front bodices aside and bring back our back bodice main piece again. So now placing our back bodice main piece correct side facing up, on one side using a removable sewing marker, we are going to be measuring 3/8 inch in from the cut out section of the back neckline and place a mark along the straight raw edge of the shoulder. Like so. So I've just measured 3/8 inch in from the cutout on the back, and I've placed that mark along that shoulder edge. We are then going to repeat that for the opposite side. Now, placing our front bodice over the back bodice main, correct sides together, ensuring that the flutters are sitting on top of the back bodice ties. we are going to now align the short raw end of one of the flutters with the top straight raw edge of the corresponding shoulder. We're going to align the straight inner edge of the flutter to the inside of the 3/8 of an inch mark that we have just created on our back bodice. The curved edge of the flutter will be facing the arm's eye. So we are going to now pin or clip that in place. We are then going to head to the sewing machine to baste the flutter in place using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have then basted one of your flutters in place, we are now going to repeat for the remaining flutter on the other side. Once you have then basted that second flutter in place, now we are going to locate the back bodice lining, and we are going to place that over the back bodice main, right sides together. We are going to be aligning the raw edges. Now the flutters and also the back bodice ties are now going to be sandwiched between the main and the lining fabrics. We are then going to pin or clip our back bodice lining in place to our back bodice main along the arm's eyes and the neckline. Once you have then pinned your back bodice lining to your back bodice main, right sides together, along the arm's eyes and also the neckline, sandwiching your flutters and back bodice ties in between. We are now going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew where we've pinned using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch, being careful to not accidentally catch the flutters or the back bodice ties in that seam. Once you have then finished sewing around your arms, eyes and neckline, now along one of the shoulders, we are going to reinforce the flutter attachment by sewing another line of stitching that will be 1/8 of an inch above the initial seam. So we are going to be just using a regular straight stitch, and these reinforcement stitches will be inside of the seam allowance. We can then repeat that for the remaining shoulder as well. Then once you have reinforced both flutters, then we are going to clip the corners and also the curve around the neckline, being careful to not clip through any stitching. We are then going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. Pinking shears can also be used. Once we have clipped those corners, the curve, and also have trimmed the seam allowance down, we are then going to turn the back bodice correct side out and then press using a low heat setting. Once you have then finished pressing your back bodice, now we are going to separate the bodice main and lining pieces. So I have my front bodice here and my back bodice here. I'm now going to separate my main and lining fabrics away from each other for my front bodice, and then I'll do the same for my back bodice as well. Now we are going to place one side of the back bodice onto the corresponding side of the front bodice, correct sides together. Then we are going to align the raw side edges and the neckline and arm's eye seams, then pin or clip in place. So as you can now see, I have flipped my back bodice over to be right sides together with my front bodice. So my back bodice main is now facing my front bodice main, and my back bodice lining is now right sides together with my front bodice lining. I have aligned those raw side edges and also the neckline and arm's eye seams and pinned. Now we are going to repeat that for the remaining side as well. Once we have both side seams pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. We are now going to sew where we have pinned to now create our side seams. Once you have then sewn your side seams, we are then going to carefully press the seams open using a low heat setting. Then turn the bodice the correct side out. Once you have then turned your bodice out the right way, you can go ahead and give it another good press with a low heat setting. Now the next step is optional, and that is to now baste your bodice, main and lining fabrics together along the bottom raw edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a basting stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and do that step now for those of you who are wanting to go ahead and do that as well, and we'll come back to show you exactly what that will look like. So if you have decided to go ahead with that optional step of basting your main and lining fabrics together along that bottom raw edge, this is now what that will look like. So it's just a simple line of straight basting stitches to secure both of those fabrics in place. Now the next step is optional again, and that is adding clear elastic to the bottom raw edge of your bodice for stability. So clear elastic can be added to the waistline of knit bodices to add stability. So to do that, we are going to cut a length of clear elastic that is slightly bigger than the circumference of the bottom raw edge of the bodice. So I've just gone ahead and cut my elastic to be a little bit bigger than the circumference of my bodice at the waistline there. Now we are going to stretch it gently just to relax the elastic. Now turn the bodice wrong side out. And we are going to start by aligning the elastic to the bottom raw edge of our bodice lining. So I just have my bodice upside down to work with it here. Now we are going to start that at one of the side seams in our bodice. So I have just popped a pin in my clear elastic to hold that in place at the side seam to show you exactly what we will be doing. So now using an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, we are going to attach the elastic to the bottom of the bodice, ensuring to sew through both the lining and the main fabrics as well as the elastic. So we are going to align the long straight edge of the elastic with the bottom raw edge of our bodice, and we will sew to attach. Once you have then finished attaching your clear elastic to the bottom raw edge of your bodice, then you can go ahead and simply just trim off the excess. And you will now be looking at your completed hibiscus bodice. So to begin the construction of the Playsuit, we are going to start by constructing the optional pockets. If you are, however, not adding the pockets, you can skip ahead in the video to the construction of the Playsuit. So to begin the construction of the optional pockets, we are going to locate the front Playsuit pieces, specifically the left front Playsuit piece to begin with. So I have my left front Playsuit piece here, correct side facing up towards me. Now we are going to locate the pocket paper pattern piece and align it over the top left hand corner of the left front Playsuit piece. If desired, you can also pin or clip that into position. Once you have that in position, we are then going to cut out the corner of the Playsuit front piece to match the pocket curve on the paper pattern piece. So I'm going to go ahead now and do that off camera, then we'll come back once I have that cut to show exactly what that will look like. So once you have then finished cutting out the corner of the Playsuit front piece to match the pocket curve on the paper pattern piece, this is now what that will look like. So when we remove that piece that we have cut off and place one of our pockets on there, you will see they have the exact same curve. So we are now going to repeat that for the right front Playsuit piece. Once you have then repeated that for your right front Playsuit piece, this is now what your front Playsuit pieces will look like if you are planning on adding the optional pockets. Now a quick tip at this stage, if you are planning on adding a trim or piping to the pocket seams, then it is best to now base that onto the pocket curve now, taking into account the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So now working on just our left front Playsuit piece again, we are going to locate the pocket pieces and place the corresponding pocket piece over the curved edge of the left front Playsuit piece, correct sides together. Now we are going to align the raw edges and then pin or clip in place along the pocket curve. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew to attach using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. If a trim or piping has been added, it will now be sandwiched in between your pocket piece and your front Playsuit piece. Once you have then finished attaching your pocket piece to your left front Playsuit piece, we are now going to clip the curves, being careful not to clip through any stitching to allow the pocket to then sit nicely when it is turned correct side out. We are then going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. Alternatively, pinking shears can be used. Then we are going to fold the pocket piece to the back of the left front Playsuit piece and press using a low heat setting. Now we can flip our Playsuit piece over so that we are looking at the right side of the pocket and the correct side of our front Playsuit piece is now facing down. We are now going to fold the pocket piece back onto itself, correct sides together, so that it is now folded in half and the straight raw edges along both the side, the top and the bottom are now all aligned. We are now going to press that in place using a low heat setting. Once pressed, we can now pin or clip the raw bottom edges of the pocket together, being careful to not accidentally catch the Playsuit underneath. We can then carefully pull the pinned or clipped pocket off to the side. We are then going to head to the sewing machine to sew along the bottom raw edge of the pocket using a straight stitch and a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We can then go on to finish the raw edges as well using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then sewn your pocket and you've also finished that bottom raw edge, now we are going to align the straight raw edges along the top and the side of the pocket with the corresponding straight raw edges of the left front Playsuit piece. Then pin or clip in place. So I have just gone ahead and pinned my pocket in place along the top and side raw edges. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine and base the pocket in place along the pinned raw edges using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Being careful to not accidentally distort the pocket whilst basting. Once you have then basted your pocket in place, this is now what that is going to look like. So now we are going to repeat those same steps for our right front Playsuit piece. Then once you have repeated those steps for your right front Playsuit piece as well, you will now be looking at both of your front Playsuit pieces complete with pockets attached. So now we are going to begin the construction of our Playsuit. So the following instructions will be the same for all Playsuit versions, with or without pockets. So we're going to start by locating one of the front Playsuit pieces. So I have my left front Playsuit piece here. We are then going to place it correct side facing up towards us. Then locate the corresponding back Playsuit piece and place it on top, correct sides together. Now we're going to align the raw side edges and pin or clip in place. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch to sew where we've pinned. Then we can also finish off the raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished attaching one of your back Playsuit pieces to the corresponding front Playsuit piece, and you've also finished that raw edge off as well, then we are going to open out the Playsuit pieces, and using a low heat setting, we are going to carefully press the seam allowance towards the back Playsuit piece. Then we are going to finish the bottom raw edge of the Playsuit using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, ensuring not to trim off any fabric whilst doing so. If a cover stitch machine is going to be used to hem the leg openings, the edges will not need to be finished in this step though. Now, using a low heat setting, we are going to carefully press the finished bottom edge of the Playsuit up by 5/8 of an inch, wrong sides together, to create a memory crease. So I'm just going to work with my Playsuit upside down. So this is the bottom edge of my Playsuit. And I'm now going to fold and press that up towards the wrong side of my fabric by 5/8 of an inch. So now you can see the memory crease that I have just created, which is 5/8 of an inch up from the bottom edge of my Playsuit pieces. Now we are going to repeat those steps for the remaining set of front and back Playsuit pieces. So I've just gone ahead and completed those steps for my remaining set of Playsuit pieces. Now we are going to place the two Playsuit sections correct sides together. Ensure that the two front sections are placed together, and the same for the two back sections. We are going to align the raw edges along the front and back risers, which are the curved sections. We can then go ahead and pin or clip those in place. Once we then have both Playsuit sections pinned correct sides together along those curved sections, we are now going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew to attach using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. We can then go ahead and finish both raw edges as well using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished attaching both Playsuit sections together and you've finished those raw edges, then now using a low heat setting, we are going to carefully press the front rise seam towards one side of the garment and then press the back rise seam towards the opposite side. Now this makes no difference as to which side is pressed in which direction, just as long as the two seams are pressed in opposite directions. Now, ensuring that the Playsuit is still turned the wrong side out, we're going to open out the Playsuit and align the raw edges of the inseams, making sure that the memory creases along the bottom edges of the leg openings are unfolded. So I'm going to flip mine upside down to work with it. So we are going to be aligning these raw edges, and this is where it's going to come in handy that those seams were pressed in opposite directions. As you can now see, my back seam is facing to the left and the seam for my front Playsuits is facing to the right. So we're going to match the center front and center back seams there and pin. And then we are going to continue aligning and pinning the inseam. Once again, making sure that those memory creases are unfolded. Now we are going to head to our sewing machine to sew where we have pinned using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. We will then also be finishing the raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished sewing the inseam, now ensuring that once again the Playsuit is still turned wrong side out, we are going to be refolding the hem memory crease and pressing again using a low heat setting if needed. Now as we go, we are going to be pinning or clipping the hem up in place. So I've just gone ahead and refolded that hem up in place using that existing memory crease. Now I'm going to go ahead and repeat that for the remaining leg. Once you have then folded up both hems and you have pinned or clipped those in place, now we are going to head to the sewing machine to edge stitch both hems in place using a 1/8 of an inch or less seam allowance and either a cover stitch machine, a twin needle, or a long straight stitch. So I will head to my sewing machine now. I'm going to be using a twin needle to hem mine, then we'll be back to show you what that will look like. So I have just gone ahead and edge stitched my hems in place. So once you have done that, you are now looking at your completed bottom half of your Playsuit. So now we are going to be constructing our skirts. So this is for the top or dress version. Now for the purpose of the tutorial, the dress version is going to be shown. However, the steps will be the same for both versions. Now we're going to be locating our two skirt pieces and we're going to be placing the front and the back skirt pieces right sides together, aligning the raw edges. We are then going to pin or clip those in place along the straight side edges. Once you then have both of your skirt pieces pinned right sides together along those straight side raw edges, now is also an ideal time to add in any care and size labels. So I have just gone ahead and added mine into that side raw edge so it will be enclosed in my side seam. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine where we are going to sew where we've pinned using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. Then we can also finish off those raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished attaching your front and back skirt pieces together and you've finished those raw edges as well, then we are going to press those seams towards the back of our skirt. Now we are going to begin the hemming process of our skirt, but prior to hemming we are going to be finishing the bottom raw edge of the skirt using either a overlocker or a zigzag stitch, ensuring not to trim off any of the fabric whilst doing so. If a cover stitch machine is being used for the hem, then the edges will not need to be finished in this step. Once you have then finished the bottom raw edge of your skirt, now the next step is optional but is definitely recommended, especially for a circle skirt. So because the bottom finished edge of the skirt is curved, to assist with hemming the skirt, we can actually sew a long basting stitch along the entire hem, 1/2 inch from the finished edge. It's very important to ensure that these basting stitches are sewn accurately, as we will then use these as a guide when pressing up our hem shortly. So I will go ahead and do that step to come back and show you exactly what that will look like if you do decide to go ahead with that optional step. So this is now what that step will look like if you've decided to go ahead with that. So I have just sewn a row of basting stitches around the entire bottom edge of my skirt. That is 1/2 inch from that bottom finished edge. So now we're going to be pressing the finished hem of the skirt 1/2 inch wrong sides together using a low heat setting. So if the optional basting stitches were sewn in that previous step, these can be now used as a guide. Now once you have finished pressing up your hem and you've pinned or clipped that in place, now we are going to edge stitch the hem in place using a 1/8 of an inch or less seam allowance and either a cover stitch machine, a twin needle, a long straight stitch or a regular straight stitch if stretch thread is being used. So I'm going to go ahead and use a twin needle for my hem. Then we can remove the basting stitches if they were also used in that previous step. So I will go ahead now and edge stitch my hem up in place, and then we'll also remove those basting stitches. Once you have then finished edge stitching your hem in place, then you are now looking at your completed skirt. So now we are going to be attaching the skirt or playsuit to our bodices. For the purpose of this tutorial, the dress skirt is going to be shown. However, the steps will be the same for the top skirt and also the playsuit versions. So firstly, we are going to take our skirt or playsuit and turn it wrong side out. We are then going to take our bodice and place that inside of the skirt or playsuit so that our fabrics are correct sides together. Also keeping in mind the placement of your front bodice, so making sure that aligns with the front of your playsuit or skirt, and also matching the back bodice with the back of your playsuit or skirt. Now we are going to be aligning the bottom raw edge of our bodice with the top raw edge of our skirt or playsuit, matching the side seams of the skirt or playsuit to the side seams of our bodice, and pinning or clipping in place. Once you have then finished pinning your skirt or playsuit to your bodice, right sides together, now we are going to head to our sewing machine to sew to attach using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. We can then also finish the raw edges using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Once you have then finished attaching your skirt or playsuit to your bodice, and you've also finished that raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, we can then turn the garment correct side out. And we are now going to press that seam allowance now up towards the bodice. Then you are now looking at your completed hibiscus. So here is my hibiscus dress and also my completed hibiscus playsuit. But that is now everything for the hibiscus sew along. Congratulations on now completing your beautiful hibiscus top, dress or playsuit. I hope that you have all enjoyed sewing along with me today. If you have, please make sure to give us a like and also subscribe to our channel for future sew along videos. If you would like to join in our sew alongs in real time, we actually have our sew along with Peony Patterns Facebook group, and this is where we host the sew alongs and split the construction up over a matter of days to actually sew each step side by side. There are always amazing prizes to also be won simply by participating. You can also join our main Peony Patterns Facebook group as well. This is where you can then share any of your makes using patterns by Peony Patterns or ask any questions that you may have. So I will pop a link to both of those groups down below. Once again, a huge thank you goes out to Dusty Moon Fabric Studio for so generously sponsoring the hibiscus sew along and gifting us with those beautiful fabrics. And thank you to all of you as well for joining in and sewing along with me today. I look forward to seeing you all again very soon for another sew along.